Hey everybody, Jane here, and I just finished reading James, and I wanted to share my thoughts about this book. I am going to be getting into some spoiler territory, so just be aware of that if you are viewing this. So, James is a retelling slash reimagining of Huckleberry Finn, and I did recently read Huckleberry Finn, and I was not a huge fan of Huckleberry Finn. Um, I thought, among other things, that Jim, who is the same character who is in James, was very poorly portrayed in Huckleberry Finn. And I assume that this book was the author trying to do justice for Jim. And I don't necessarily always think the book did great on that, but I still appreciated that that's what it seemed like it was trying to do. So in Huckleberry Finn, Jim is an escaped slave. He has run off because he has been threatened that he is going to be sold down the river. And he meets Huckleberry along the Mississippi River. And they kind of know each other because they're from the same town. And they go on this really cool adventure together. The setup for this is very similar. Um, it starts a little bit sooner, and we have a little bit more background for James. Now, one thing that is really important to note, and I had mixed feelings about this, and part of it is because I have not read any history that would indicate that this was commonly done during that time frame, although I guess it could have been. James and the other slaves have a language that they use when they are with the other slaves versus when they are with the white folk. So when they are with the other slaves, they are very well spoken. And when they are with the white folk, they basically dumb down their language to make themselves sound stupid and unassuming and to make the white people comfortable. And I thought that was a really interesting concept, but I don't know if that's something that really happened, and it kind of felt weird as I was reading it to think that that was the case. Because they're teaching their kids, they have these classes with the slave children of, okay, here's how you say it, when there's white people around, just so they don't know that we are smart and intelligent and everything. And I think in Huckleberry Finn, I did feel like Jim was played as unintelligent. He was played as uneducated, and James is much more educated. He is well spoken. He just speaks poorly to hide it from the white man that he can, to appease the white man. And he also in James is knows how to read and to write. And he's taught himself that. And I have some kind of issues with that as well. He taught himself to read using books in Judge Thatcher's library. And I think my question slash issue, like, yes, people can teach themselves to read, but Judge Thatcher is an adult. He's going to have adult books, and he's going to have fairly difficult to read books. And we know this because Jim will have, throughout the story, these dreams where he is speaking to writers such as Voltaire and talking about the books that they've written. And I just didn't necessarily find it super believable that somebody who was born a slave and didn't have any formal education taught himself to read from adult books and was able to read something as complex as Voltaire. Maybe that is something that totally happens. And I could see, like, I think this would have been more believable for me if he'd have been able to find young reader books and teach himself to read, or if he had like a mentor who was teaching him to read, but he doesn't. So our James is set up to be very, very different than Jim in Huckleberry Finn. James also is threatened with being sold, and he runs away. In both books, Jim does have a wife and daughter who he is as he is on the run, trying to figure out a way to come back and free them as well. It is his hope to be able to make money and to buy them. Now, this does have some problems. For instance, a escaped slave cannot buy another slave. So he already knows in the early part of the book that this is going to be difficult to do. Not only does he have to raise money, but he has to find somebody who legally can buy a slave to help him. As he is traveling in the book James, he does meet Huckleberry Finn. And the initial setup is actually very, very similar to the Huckleberry Finn books. There is a change that happens, or that we're made kind of aware of fairly early on, that I was not a huge fan of. I think I understood why the author made the choice to do it, but I wish they had not. And that is, they made James Huckleberry Finn's biological father in this book. So in Huckleberry Finn, the book, Huckleberry is being raised by an abusive dad. And he runs away and he has to hate me. I don't know why he hates me. And then also, and he hates you too, Jim. And we are told more or less that in the later part of the book that Jim and Huckleberry's mother had a thing, and that Huckleberry's father probably was abusing him because he suspected that James was Huckleberry's father. This also explains why James is so caring towards Huckleberry. And I think because of the character that James is, because James is kind of a very angry character in this version, and he should be. Like, the things that happen to him and to all slaves are very, very bad. So, like, I'm not upset that he's kind of a angry character, but I think the author had to make them related to justify why James is willing to go on this adventure with Huckleberry. I didn't like that choice, though, for a lot of reasons, including just it didn't feel aligned at all with the original story. And also, it doesn't end up mattering in some ways. There are situations where Jim chooses Huckleberry over other people. There is a situation in the latter part of the book where there is a shipwreck, and Jim at that point has been traveling with his friend Norman, and Norman and Huckleberry and Jim all are in the shipwreck, and Jim has to choose who to save, or James has to choose who to save, and so he saves Huckleberry instead of his friend Norman. But at the end of the book, Huckleberry doesn't go with Jim and his wife and daughter to the north. James ends up traveling with them alone, and Huckleberry is back in foster care. And we're given the impression that this is to protect him, and also because, James doesn't want Huckleberry to be raised as a slave. And, if he were to admit his parentage, he would be a slave, even though he doesn't look black, he looks white. And there is an actually really interesting discussion of Huckleberry trying to figure out, like, who he is, and particularly, like, he was raised white, but now he knows he's not, and how does that change his perspective on things? Additionally, in the original book, there is no mention of the Civil War, at least that I recall. And in this book, the Civil War has already started, which I had kind of mixed feelings about if that changes the stakes, because Jim and his wife and daughter, they're, escaping. But we know as readers of history that when the Civil War is over, they're going to be free anyway. So I thought that was an interesting choice by the author too, to bring that in. And I think part of it was the author, I assume, wanted to make a commentary about the motivations for the Civil War, and that they really didn't have anything to do with helping slaves. There is a whole conversation as they're talking about the war going on, where James is like, the people doing this, they're not doing it because they care about black people. They don't really want the slaves being freed. That's just like a side effect of what's going on. It's not the point. I do think the author was trying to make a lot of really interesting points with this book. I want to be careful about my assumptions because I have not read a ton of books from this time period. And I also am a white woman. And so my commentary on things is from that perspective. Definitely, I would be more interested in hearing a Black perspective on this book. And if I am interpreting things the way they were intended or not, because I'm not sure. I really wanted there to be an author's note at the end to explain some of the choices and changes, but at least I listened to this on audio, and in the version I was listening to, there was not. I do think this is a great audiobook, particularly with the huge differences in language that James and the other people who are Black, the way they speak to each other versus the way that they speak when they're in the presence of somebody who's white. I do think that that comes across very, very well in this story as an audiobook. And I don't know if I would have understood how different it is in a physical eye reading book. The early part of James does follow fairly closely to Huckleberry Finn. There were a couple things that I wasn't sure if I just was misremembering about Huckleberry Finn or if they were changes, but like up until maybe a little before the midway, I was like, okay, yeah, this is still the same story I was remembering. But this book does eventually take off on a very, very different pathway. And while I understand why, and I think it probably had to tell the story the author was trying to tell, I was a little bit disappointed because I wanted James's perspective or justification or whatever on the later half of the later parts of the Huckleberry Finn book, because the way Jim acts in Huckleberry Finn drove me insane at the end of the book. And I wanted to see like the play on how the James character in James, why they would act the way they did. But the author just completely changed like the whole latter half of the book. So we have in both books Huckleberry and James meeting the King and the Duke. And the King and the Duke are conmen. And in the book, in the Huckleberry Finn book, the conmen are running several cons, and at some point they decide to sell Jim or to like turn him in as a runaway slave to get money because their cons have not been working well and they are very greedy people. And then in Huckleberry Finn, a lot of the latter book is spent with Huckleberry trying to find Jim and to help him escape. And in the book Huckleberry Finn, Jim is being held by Tom Sawyer's uncle, I believe it is. And the Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn create this whole really crazy, honestly, plan to break Jim out. And the whole last quarter of the Huckleberry Finn book is about all of these hoops that basically Tom Sawyer has Jim jump through to be released. And I really hated that in Huckleberry Finn. It drove me crazy. And we are told then that Jim is illiterate because like they're having him do this writing on a shirt in Huckleberry Finn, and he's like, I don't know how to do that. I can't write letters. And where this James is very well educated, he actually steals a pencil, and another slave is killed for it because they stole and they thought he stole, but it was really Jim who has the pencil. So in this, or it's really James. So in this book, James is very literate. He can write, and in this one, he does not. That doesn't happen at all. And that was actually the part of the book I was most interested in getting James's perspective on. But instead, in James, he knows that the Duke and the King cannot be trusted, and he runs away from them. And when he runs away, he becomes, I guess I need to back up a minute. He doesn't run away right away. So he is temporarily sold by the King and the Duke to a smithy. And these other people show up who need a tenor in their music group. And they buy James from the smithy, even though the smithy doesn't own him. He's just like has him on hold until the King and the Duke come back. And so James goes off with these singers. And that's where he meets Norman, who I mentioned earlier, who becomes one of his friends. And Norman is also a white passing black man. And him and James decide they don't like performing with this group. The group is performing in blackface, and they are performing songs that are traditionally from these enslaved people. And Norman has been with the group for a while, and I don't really understand why. I think him seeing Jim's treatment within the group and treatment by the audience is what changes things. But him and Norman end up running off, and they come up with this plot that in order to get money, because Norman wants to free his family the same way James wants to free his. So they are going to get this scheme to earn money, and they are going to have Norman pass as James's master and sell him, and then James is going to escape and come back to Norman, and Norman is going to sell him again, and it's going to be like a repeat cycle, and they're just going to keep making money off of selling James. Well, then that doesn't go very well, actually. James is sold, and the master he's sold to is brutally awful, like the first day. And he meets a 15-year-old girl who reminds him a lot of his daughter, and decides that based on the kind of treatment she's getting there, he cannot leave her to be abused by the by everybody there. So he actually helps Sammy, her name's Sammy, escape. Well, then they are chased, and Sammy is actually killed during the escape. And it's really, this whole book is very hard-hitting. Like, I enjoyed the conversations and the mistreat. Like, I don't want to say enjoy it. It was interesting to learn about how very badly treated slaves were. And some of it was perspectives that I had never been shown before. So I appreciated all that. But this is also a very hard-hitting book, and it's a very difficult read, as it probably should be. But it was very, very emotional to read. And like, I didn't expect them to kill Sammy, but they killed Sammy. That's the girl's name. They killed Sammy. He'd barely gotten her out, and, she died. And then shortly after that is when they end up in the boat, and Jim finds Huck again and chooses to save Huckleberry over Norman. I had a good time reading this. I didn't always think that what happened was super realistic. I was sad for the deviations from the original book, even though I understood why it was done, because the character of James in this book would not have tolerated Huckleberry and Tom Sawyer's shenanigans, even if Huckleberry was his biological son. There is no way that James would have tolerated the crap that Jim from Huckleberry Finn does in the end of the book. There's just no way James would have done it, because James is a very strong character. He is a very active protagonist, whereas Jim in Huckleberry Finn is a very passive character. He's kind of following along. He's very subservient. He's very submissive. And he just kind of goes along with the little boy's shenanigans. And in the Huckleberry Finn book, even when he could escape at the end, he doesn't, because Tom, after putting him through all this craziness, Tom is shot, and Jim stays with him to make sure that he's okay, which I think he had to do in Huckleberry Finn to make the point that Mark Twain was trying to make. Like, I want to say in some ways Mark Twain almost made Jim too pure and angelic. And in James, we have a much stronger, almost cutthroat character. He kills some people, not just Sammy. Like, there is a point where he goes near the end of the book where he is trying to get his wife and daughter released, and he kills a man. So James in this book is a lot more cutthroat, is a lot more, I'm going to do what I need to do regardless. He loves Huck, but in a very different way than Jim from Huckleberry Finn did. And in Huckleberry Finn, Huckleberry is the point of view character, and in this, James is the point of view character. And I think it's interesting how different those perspectives are, even on the part of the book where they are together. And I was fascinated by that take of, telling a classic story in another point of view and see how the story changes. I was a little bit disappointed, may not be the right word. The ending for James was kind of abrupt. As I said, I was listening to it on audiobook, and at about 9 minutes to the end of it, I was like, how are we going to wrap this up in 9 minutes? And it did technically do an okay job, but I felt like we could have had a little bit more length at the end. I would have been perfectly okay with a little more length at the end, and more like Jim rescues his wife and daughter and they go north. And I think the last scene is really good. It really is punchy. Not funny punchy, but like it packs a punch. But I would have liked the end to be a little bit longer, maybe, because basically, like, they show up, he frees all the slaves at the place that his wife and daughter are being held, because it's not the same place that he escaped from. And just, it's like, oh, okay, we're all free now. We're in the north. And I was just like, oh, okay, that's kind of crazy. That all happened really fast. And again, he does not have Huckleberry with him, which I thought was an interesting choice, considering Huckleberry is his son in the book James. I would have liked to see him, I think. I guess I can see why it wouldn't be practical to take Huckleberry, but I would have loved to see maybe an epilogue where after the war and Jim and his family are free, where he goes back for Huckleberry and they can be together. If him having Huckleberry as his son and then leaving Huckleberry in foster care was a very strange choice to me. I absolutely understand that he did it in the context of the story of he didn't want Huckleberry to be a slave, and Huckleberry could only be free if people didn't know that he was Jim's son. But then, like, he's been doing all these adventures with Huckleberry, and it's never been an issue. So I don't understand why Huckleberry couldn't go with him and they could make it work. I don't know. Or when they were all free, why not just have Huckleberry go with him and be like, yeah, this is my son. He's just very light. So yeah, I ended up giving this book a 4-star because I really was engaged with it. I thought it was a lot of really interesting discussions and representation of what slavery was like and who Jim could have been. And James is a very interesting character. He's not always a very sympathetic character, and he's nothing like Jim in the books, who is always very sympathetic. There were times that, you always understand why James is doing what he's doing, but, he's not always somebody that is fun to read, even though the book is itself very entertaining. There were a lot of points where I was like, I'm not sure how the logic goes. Like, I had never read about people having slaves using like coded language. And I don't know if that's something the author made up for this book, or if it was something that really did happen, that slaves turned their language, that their masters were caught off guard and thought they were more subservient, etc. I don't know if that's something that really happened, and it might have been. It just seems to me that would be a very complicated thing to make really happen, because, a lot of these people, these slaves, were from Africa. Like, even James talks about, he thinks he was taken on a boat, and Norman does remember being taken on a boat. And so this is in some cases not even the slave's first language, and they're speaking it as eloquently as, if not more so than the white people around them. But also, like, I'm not sure how eloquently the people around them would be speaking English anyway. I wasn't sure I believed some of that. Or like I said earlier, like James being educated and being able to teach himself to read through very advanced books. I'm not saying those things couldn't happen, and I'm not saying they didn't happen. They were a little harder for me to believe. But again, maybe historically the author is aware that that was something that happened frequently, and I don't know the answer. And like I said, I would have loved a note from the author telling us why they made those choices. But yeah, I liked James better than I liked Huckleberry Finn. I was disappointed that the part of Huckleberry Finn where Jim plays the biggest role, and where I really wanted to see his perspective on things, didn't happen in the book. I appreciated the changes the author made, though I didn't always like those changes. And I thought this was a very interesting book. I think it is a little hard for me to have a full understanding of it because I am white. And like, I recognize that when I consume literature that is like James, I realize that it impacts, having a very different history and background impacts how I consume it versus how an African American would consume the same literature. So I would be really interesting to get other perspectives on this book and to see historically if some of it was more or less accurate than, for instance, things were portrayed in Huckleberry Finn. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see a more historic, viewpoint of, yes, this is stuff that we have documentation of, or no, this is not, but it was made up for the story, and it does make the story interesting. It's definitely a story about fighting back, and that is kind of the whole plot, is James gets to fight back, and in Huckleberry Finn, he does not. And so I don't know if you call it a redemption story, because Jim was never, like, he didn't do anything to need redemption, but it was like, he is a certain character who is very passive and having everything done to him in Huckleberry Finn, and this is James taking control and being like, no, this is what's happening to me. I'm going to be the driving force in my own life. I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to make the things happen that didn't happen in Huckleberry Finn. I will point out, though, in Huckleberry Finn, James is freed at the end. We don't ever find out if he gets his wife and daughter, but he was freed because his owner had died and freed him in his will. So in both stories, James does end up a free man, but in very different ways. So it was interesting to see how the author took this story. I didn't always love everything with it, but it was a very interesting ride along the way. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to my thoughts on this. Bye. Pictures and patterns put into words that stream across the page.